Hello, everyone.
Just
How
one
do
sec.
we know?
One sec. It's connecting. Yep, we're live.
Are we? And how do we know where people are? Or is it the people that are there that?
Yes, the attendees.
Hello, everyone.
Just
How
one
do
sec.
we know?
One sec. It's connecting. Yep, we're live.
Uh, well, welcome all to the webinar. I see we've already got 20 people up here, Janish. Yeah, is that right?
Yep.
Okay, so we're going to give a few people more. We have 155 registered at the moment. So we're just going to give people a few minutes while we start, but we've got a pretty long way to go. So I think we might as well make a start. What do the others think? Yes? Yeah. Okay, then. So, Janish, let's just begin. And when people will join in, they'll join in. Yeah. Welcome all. This is the start of the ADHD Awareness Month. And in pure ADHD style, I've got the first webinar wrong. We are all webinar virgins out here. So, this is the first time our team is actually ever doing this. Anyway, so we actually got the webinar wrong in the sense that this is listed by the ADHD Federation. And they actually put out a webinar for worldwide, what it is. And we managed to download the brief for the 2019 webinar. But the best part is that now we can hold another webinar for you for the 2021 in the following week. So welcome to this anyway, because we didn't have it last year. So this is busting myths about ADHD and what we can do. So what we're starting out with is me. It's just my lived experience with ADHD and moving into the different speakers that we have. We got a packed seminar session for you guys with lots of great speakers which have consented to give us their time. So, Janish, without further ado, let's go into the first video. Okay. I just wanted to say that this is how I see ADHD, and this is how my brain works with ADHD. So, it is a mass of color, numbers, and words all jumbled up together. Janish, we need to play it. Okay, that's not working, so I'm just going to keep talking. Go on to the next slide, Janish, then. Sorry, guys. Technology. Janish is a holistic and well-being technologist. And now, does that include your butt being kicked at the end of this or not? So, okay, Janish, you want me to just go straight into the slide. Is that it? The video, is any of the videos going to play?
I am working on that.
Okay, so I have to go backwards on it. All right, guys. I say, well, that's the best way to do it. Okay, then. So I've already said that we stuffed up the first webinar. Now we've stuffed up the video, Janish. And I thought you didn't have ADHD. I was the only one with ADHD and attentional issues because my team, I thought I was going to go out and get the team, which was going to be neurotypical. Neurotypical, or want of a better word, is people that don't have attentional issues, that their minds work in a sequential, logical manner with task 1, task 2, task 3. So Janish, I cannot move the slide either. Yeah. Janish, I cannot move the slides either. And you're on mute. This is great.
I said it's the arrow keys.
I know it's the arrow keys, Jinesh. I'm trying. It is not moving. Okay, guys. This is what I first. So basically, guys, this is what I learned very first time with ADHD. There was always the rejection sensitivity dysphoria. I got so tired of saying I'm sorry that I used to just send this video out in the end. And all it is a Britney Spears song talking about, oops, I did it again. And Janish, I can't move to the next slide either. Let me just give a few quick introductions. We're talking about attention coach, which is us. We then are going to talk about what is best practice. We also have coaches of attention, which is going to be me and Irene. And then we have our lovely doctors who've consented to come here, which is Dr. Didi, Dr. Dai, Grocott, and my first coach, Dr. Michelle Tona, the one who helped me through all of my struggles with ADHD. Anyway, until I got time to become a coach. Janish, can we move to the next slide, please? So the struggle with ADHD is a real struggle. Busting the myths, the first myth that we're talking about is the struggle real? Don't worry about the video, Janish, please. Let's just move to the slide, and I'm going to simply talk about what is the struggle that we actually had with ADHD. Yeah. So we talk about the need for dopamine. Moving into the next two slides down, Janish, please. Yep. They talk about drama. There was supposed to be a lot of drama to be created with the videos, but that's obviously not going to work. So I'm going to ignore that and move ahead with my standard ADHD flaw, which is thinking on my feet, because now we have prepared this for ages, but of course, this is not going to work the way it is. So with the drama comes the need for dopamine. In my brain, at least, the need for drama was a label that was given to me. It was and I usually just called it the fable of the label. Yeah, which is what was going to be one of the videos that was supposed to be playing back. But since we don't have that, I'm just going to do this as I do it with anything else, off the seat of my pants. Yeah. So, okay, the need for dopamine. They call me a drama queen. They call me a people pleaser. They call me somebody who can't get things right. Obviously, right now you can see that is there. But every single time the finger was pointed is when I shriveled up and could not move. It's like having a sledgehammer thrown at you in your brain, where your brain is frozen. There's nothing you can do. The need for drama arises as the need for dopamine arises. ADHD is a lack of dopamine. Our brains don't engage that easily. This particular slide, now that it's up there, was supposed to be a video that I was going to talk you through it, but that's fine. All that we are trying to make here is that it's not really our fault when we have the need for drama. It's the need for dopamine. And the way I owned it was very simple, by calling out on it and coming out with it. I came out as a drama queen. I came out and owned the labels of whatever people were throwing at me. People pleaser, great. I am a people pleaser, but I eventually learned to use that as my strength. Moving from there, we are going to talk about what happens here. So, Janish, next slide, please. And are we going to be able to play back Dr. Didi's video?
Yes.
Okay, so we're talking about the D story here. And we go into the first D story, which is with Dr. Didi. Jinesh, I think we're going to avoid all videos altogether and just stop, please. Let's just go moving on from there. We're going to move on to the first. Yes, sorry, what?
Yep.
Good afternoon, everybody, and I would like to thank you all for giving up your time and attention to this webinar. My name is Dr. Jack Deedy. I'm a family physician with over 25 years experience in general practice and a special interest in ADHD. I have realized that it is a subject that is rarely discussed and there is a huge lack of awareness by people in general. Many people with ADHD struggle with the diagnosis, finding it difficult to navigate their way through diagnosis and treatment and developing support network. I would like to draw attention to the way ADHD is suspected, diagnosed and treated, and indeed it is a very treatable condition. One of the major problems with ADHD is the difficulty in diagnosis. Attention deficit disorder is a condition that is often misdiagnosed as the symptoms often overlap with other conditions. It also seems to be underdiagnosed, mainly due to a lack of awareness of the condition. And in Australia, it is even more complicated because of the need for a patient to be referred to a psychiatrist by their regular family doctor. And there is a long time in waiting to see many psychiatrists, up to 3 months. And even then finding the right specialist in looking after them who is aware and able to help with their conditions. One of the difficulties with ADHD is that many people have got brains that are going very fast. Many people describe it as like a Ferrari engine with bicycle brakes. Many people realize that they get more thoughts in the morning, even before getting out of bed, than most normal people get all day long. It is like having a secretary that normally allows a certain amount of information into the prefrontal cortex, the executive part of the brain, and this is not working very well. And it allows everything through. So the brain gets flooded with thoughts and sometimes a difficulty in analyzing what goes into the executive center. And when everything gets through without a filter, it just becomes overwhelming. Many people with ADHD have got issues of dopamine being deficient and in certain parts of the brain. And to increase the amount of dopamine to the brain, a person might need a daily dosage of dopamine. Things that can help are having a good diet, especially diet rich in proteins, exercise, especially exercise in the morning is found to be helpful, and getting good skills at organizing and managing daily life. One of the big issues with patients with attention deficit disorder is time management. Often can be beneficial in that many people can hyper-focus or stay quite a long time on a particular topic and then forget about other topics and until it's too late and realize that much more time has gone. As a health professional and being a family doctor, many people present with often other issues, maybe anxiety, possibly depression, and many have been diagnosed previously with illnesses including bipolar disorder, addiction problems, maybe addicted to drugs or alcohol or other addictions, and often have got family conflicts at time of diagnosis, and many people present when there are major issues or fires and maybe work issues. Many people have used their ADHD for very positive effects. Many are very bright and intelligent and even geniuses at the work that they do and do very well. Often until some major crisis or something upsets how they have been going.
Okay, so that was good, Janish. We managed to play back a video. Yeah. And now we are from Dr. Didi. As we've seen, we are just talking about a quick recap of what is the Australian story here. Yeah. What the Australian story, what we are talking about here is the hard aspect of everybody to find the right medical professional. That was my journey anyway. I was lucky to find the right doctor. I was lucky to find the right thing, but there are lots of us out there right now that are struggling to find the right doctor. Currently in Australia that we already know that there's a $20 billion, ADHD currently costs us $20 billion a year. Yeah. The first step that we need in ADHD, the journey, is to find the right GP. And when we find the right GP, there's not every GP that actually has experience with people with ADHD. Once we find the right GP, we then need a referral point to find the right specialist. The specialists are all trying, the GPs are all trying, everybody's all trying. However, when we have ADHD and we need to coordinate all the appointments, coordinate all the admin that is required to actually find the right person, it makes it extremely hard. Once we found the right GP, somebody like Dr. Didi, then we can take it further and get a recommendation, and we can get somebody like Di, who's the only person in Australia, a psychiatrist, that can actually diagnose the disorder. When I say the only person in Australia, what I'm talking about is the only person in Australia that can diagnose a disorder is a psychiatrist. So without further ado, there's Dr. Di as the third part of the D story, going to tell us about the drugs and the diagnosis. Sorry, Di, here we go. Di, you're on mute. Just give me a second.
I'll get myself off.
Yep, all good.
We're good, okay. Thank you,
Yes.
Manoj. I'm certainly glad I'm not the only one in Australia who can diagnose
That's
ADHD.
good to hear it.
Hello to everybody who's out there. I have no idea who's out there. I assume it's some people with ADHD, some families, maybe some healthcare professionals, and I'm a psychiatrist. I fell into ADHD, then I found I really liked the people, but there wasn't any training. So there've been a group of us who've been working together to educate each other. We are working on a GP training program, and one of my colleagues has recently started a training program for psychiatrists, but we're doing our very best. Have a little look at this picture, and I thank Selena Lee, who is on Facebook as the ADHD Whisperer in Queensland, and she's been taking this picture around to every school that will let her through the door in Queensland, saying what you need to do is assess kids for vision and hearing, but you need to assess them for attention. Those of you who have ADHD will look at this and go, well, isn't that normal? And those who haven't got ADHD go, no, of course not. I wasn't overwhelmed like that at school. This is the start of my diagnosis. I show that to people and I just look at their faces, and you can often tell who's got ADHD because they're playing 16 channels all at once. And when my computer decides to do the next slide, which it didn't, how are we doing, Janish? Thanks. Okay, if you've come to this webinar, you know that ADHD is a real brain disorder. It's common, it's serious, it's recognisable, and it is treatable. That Australia is about 20 years behind the rest of the world, probably where breast cancer was about 20 years ago. Janish, I have no control. So if I just wave, or shall I say next slide, please? Thank you. And if you want to know the details of how the cost of ADHD, Google Deloitte and ADHD, and the last year, $20 billion, and the health minister is well aware of that, and he's making a difference. So we're all trying to make a difference to change things to make it easier. Next slide, please. ADHD is not just a mental health problem, it's actually a public health problem, because the problem is you don't have good control of the executive function, that's the frontal lobe, where you can see two perspectives, now and later, yes and no, start or stop. And if you haven't got a good frontal lobe, it's very hard to manage your diabetes or your asthma or your bank account or your parenting, or get your kids to the doctor, or get yourself to the doctor. So people with ADHD have a lot of difficulty managing lots of aspects of their life, but not always. And that's the issue about ADHD. It's very intermittent. So sometimes people are perfectly normal or absolutely brilliant, and quite often they're not, and often they don't know what's going on. So it is a real disorder. People with diabetes aren't expected to just try harder to regulate their blood sugar levels. They get education and medication and lifestyle coaching. Next slide. We think that people with ADHD shouldn't be expected to just try harder to regulate their dopamine levels in their frontal lobe. Janish, I don't have control here. So next slide, please. Thank you. So an ADHD person with their brain going all over the place needs some help with education of themselves and their family. And medication is very helpful, as well as lifestyle coaching. Next slide, please. Okay, why is the diagnosis often missed? As Dr. Jack Deedy alluded to, because there's no training, a lot of people are aware of the obvious. We know about substance use, bipolar, binge eating and anxiety, particularly depression, autism. But like the blind man and the elephant, if you've never seen an elephant, but you know a few of the things, you tend to diagnose what you know and miss the elephant. So next slide, please. The elephant in the room often is ADHD, and treatment-resistant anything often has an underlying ADHD. You look for the ADHD, you help deal with that, and then the other disorders are easier to improve or to manage. So I'm going to have a quick look at the overview of the symptoms. Next one, please, Janesh. ADHD, would you believe, is not inattention. It's actually dysregulation of attention, dis meaning bad and regulation meaning control. So people with ADHD have poor control of their attention. So they can be so overwhelmed, except when they're very excited or it's an urgent thing or a deadline, and then they're absolutely brilliant. So they have this boom or bust mentality. Next one, thanks. And they have dysregulation of their movements. So as little kids, they may be very hyperactive, but as adults, they've learned to be socially appropriate, and they have covered it up a bit. So they might be moving their tongue or their toes. Next slide, please, Janish. This is the hyperactivity of movement. The point is, they feel better when they move. So I don't say to my patients, please sit still and concentrate. I say, can you please move and concentrate? Get yourself a standing desk, move around. If your child has ADHD, give them permission to move. If you want to talk about a deep and meaningful with your partner, go for a walk together. So you're moving in parallel rather than sitting facing each other, because that becomes overwhelming. Next one, please, Janish. The next and third thing on the list of the diagnosis is impulsivity, but it's actually dysregulation of impulsivity. Sometimes there's no impulsivity at all, and sometimes there's too much. They interrupt because they care. Next slide, please, Janish. And they blurt out things, and then they lie awake at night worrying about what happened, which leads into the emotional dysregulation, which I believe is the fourth symptom, but it didn't get on the list because it's so common to every other disorder. We're trying to work out in diagnosis, what have you got that's different from something else, so we can find a different treatment. So if I wanted to diagnose the difference between a lion and a tiger, I'll say one's got stripes, one's got a mane. It doesn't tell me anything about the big cat or even how to tame it. Next slide, please, Janish. So I've got a picture here of an iceberg. just to help you understand that what's above the waterline is the inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. That's what we measure and can differentiate between disorders. And to a certain extent, the medication helps with that. But the real issues are under the waterline with your busy brain, your emotional dysregulation, anxiety, addictions, avoidance, and losses. You need skills for those things. Next one, Janish. So pills don't teach skills, but they often help the skills to be learnt. Here's a little bit about the brain. The word is synapse, S-Y-N, like syn, which means like syncing your phone, or synergy, that means together. Apps means fasten. A synapse is the place between two brain cells where they pass a message from one to the other. In the frontal lobe, that's at the front of your brain, which has the control, you've got too many of the reuptake or the recycling vacuum cleaners. So every time your brain wants to send a message, it takes a little, it's called a neurotransmitter, the little things in the bags there. And those little bags burst and the neurotransmitters pop into the space between the brain cells. They go onto the other side into the receptor, they go ping, the message is passed on. But then the little neurotransmitters are taken up by the vacuum cleaners and popped in the little bags again. So if you have too many vacuum cleaners, which you do if you have ADHD and it's genetic, it's not your fault, what can happen is if you just send a little message, it gets sucked up too quickly, so the message is too weak. But if you send a really strong message, you can make it normal. So ADHD people have the problem where they sometimes have weak messages and sometimes they have strong messages. And they can learn to overcome this. So they're often told, try harder, which they do, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. How does medication work? Well, it actually plugs these vacuum cleaners. So Ritalin and dexamphetamine plug vacuum cleaners, so you get a stronger message. And the neurotransmitter that we're most interested in is dopamine, which I'll talk about in a moment. I want to make it clear that there are illicit drugs that have a similar effect. Cocaine's a bit like Ritalin, and methamphetamine, ice and speed, is a bit like dexamphetamine. But they work not only in the vacuum cleaner sending side of the nerve partnership here, but on the receiving side. And those illicit drugs have got a nasty little tail that jams into the receptor, damages the receptor. You don't have so many receptors, so you can only get the same effect if you have more of the illicit drugs. So drugs and various things that work in the receptors can cause addiction. The medication we use for ADHD works in the sending neuron in the reuptake vacuum cleaners, and it doesn't cause addiction. Next slide, please, Janish. Here's a little idea of how you can remember the different neurotransmitters. The human body is so amazing, so wonderfully created. The main neurotransmitters, or the little messenger chemicals that you have in your brain, are they cause either on or off. On is glutamate, anything exciting gets some glutamate going, and off is GABA, calming down. Alcohol and benzodiazepines like Valium work in the GABA receptors. But next to them, you've got the little twiddle knobs, and they're the ready, steady, go knobs. Ready is noradrenaline, which gets everything more likely to fire off. Steady is serotonin, so that nerve is less likely to fire. And dopamine is move, now, go, and feel good about it. You've also got the endorphins, and you've got the cannabinoids, which are a return to midpoint. Next slide, thanks, Janish. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the twiddle knobs. If you have ADHD, your brain's a bit like a radio that's not tuned to the station. So you're getting the song and static noises and a couple of other channels as well. Next slide. Now, what you can do, you've got a couple of options on back to the noradrenaline. If you increase your volume on a radio, it's like turn up that noise, you can hear the noise you want, but you're going to hear everything else as well, and that's going to get you into overload. The next one is serotonin, which is basically calm it all down. So you're not so annoyed by the static, but you don't get your song. And a lot of people with ADHD have a problem. They get depressed, they go to somewhere. So I need the next slide, Janish. For serotonin, it's like a mute knob. And people are given an antidepressant. The basic ones increase serotonin. So they say to the doctor, I feel worse since I've had my antidepressant. And then the doctor usually increases the dose. And when you get the serotonin medications about 4 times the starting dose, those medications actually plug the vacuum cleaners for dopamine. So ADHD people often come to me on a high dose of an antidepressant, whereas the low dose made no difference. But it does help a bit, but it's better to use dopamine and noradrenaline one. Janish, next one, thanks. Particularly dopamine. Dopamine has the effect of just being able to tune in, hear what you want to hear, think what you want to think without having all the extraneous things. So when that occurs, you actually feel calm, you feel normal, you feel productive. Next one. So putting this together, okay, so what's happening in an ADHD brain? It's a bit like the teacher is the frontal lobe, has laryngitis. The messages sometimes get through to the classroom. That's called the limbic system in the subconscious, right in the middle of the brain. And if your teacher has laryngitis, well, you can give your teacher a megaphone, which is what the stimulant medications, Dex and Ritalin do, and they can very loudly amplify it so that the classroom of all the ideas and thoughts from your subconscious, they can settle down and behave themselves. But pills don't teach skills. Even if you've got the classroom together, they still have to learn their maths. But the point is, once they've learnt their maths and they can do their own thing, they need less teacher. So that's what we're aiming to do. That's how pills and skills work. Other medications, atomoxetine, is a bit like improving the laryngitis, makes the messages flow better, but that takes 6 to 12 weeks to work. And there's a new one called guanfacine, which I'm calling the teacher's aid, sitting beside the kids and calming them down. And that's particularly good for people with autistic spectrum disorder, with anxiety and with sleep difficulties. And we might use it with or without a stimulant as well. So next slide, thank you. So the question is, why do you sometimes function normally? Well, if you have enough dopamine and noradrenaline in your synapses from your frontal lobe talking to your limbic system, you're going to be absolutely normal. And if you have a look at the list there, and if you're sitting next to somebody who has ADHD, just have to think about the things that they often like to do and how they often function very well in those things. And I ask my ADHD patients, which ones do you use to be normal? And they go, some say, all of them. Okay, next slide, thank you. I know I'm bringing up more questions than I'm answering, but I just wanted to give you a quick look through so we've got some idea of what's helpful. There's a long list of medications used for ADHD. Next slide, thank you. When we decide whether we're going to use the stimulant, which is a dopamine noradrenaline reuptake vacuum cleaner inhibitor or blocker, there's a number of different things that we consider. It certainly is not one size fits all. Next one, we look at cost, we look at whether we want a long acting or a short acting, and a whole lot of different things, and also side effects. And I've got a list here of the different different psychostimulants. Usually the short-acting ones, dexamphetamine and Ritalin, they kick in 20 minutes, they last for 3 to 4 hours, and then they're gone, and sometimes there's quite a drop-off. The longer-acting ones take longer to work, so we often have a short-acting in there first to get the morning going, then the long-acting continues, and we use the short-acting towards the end, or if you've woken up at lunchtime, you don't want to use a very long-acting one. So we do lots of tweaking. What we aim to do is help the patient to find the best dose for them. Too much dopamine will give you such hyperfocus that you just can't think of anything else, and too much adrenaline will be you'll be anxious and panicking and tense and things like that. So we basically titrate the dose up to what feels good for the patient and give them the ability to work their medication with all the other sources of dopamine and noradrenaline that they're bringing to their day. So how much medication do I use? Well, it depends. It's like how many layers of clothing should I have on any day in Melbourne? It depends on the weather and what I'm doing. So we teach our patients to manage their medication. Next one, thanks. And if you understand how quickly the medication starts, the yellow line here is 2 doses of Ritalin or Dex, and then the other lines are the long-acting Ritalins. Next slide, thanks. And then there's lisdexamphetamine, which goes in as dexamphetamine attached to some food and amino acid. That can't get into the brain. And I use that for my drug addicts because you can't stick it up your arm or snort it or smoke it and get it into your brain quickly for a high. So that was basically invented so that it would be safe. It takes about an hour to work, but it lasts about 12 hours. And that one goes out through the kidneys. And if you change the acidity of the kidneys with some vitamin C, it may make a difference. Next slide, we're nearly there. Okay, there is nutritional cocktails which do treat mental illness. There's some good evidence for that from Dr. Julia Ruckledge. The next slide shows the British Journal of Psychiatry 2014 that, next slide. Thank you. She did a really elegant one with 80 patients in New Zealand with ADHD adults. They were even given the placebo or the active compound of a whole lot of vitamins and minerals which help your brain produce more dopamine and noradrenaline. And she found that of those people, after about 8 weeks, 50% had great improvement, 30% some, and 20% no change. So it's not one size fits all at all. Next slide. This is one of my favorites to show you that it's not just what happens in your brain, it's what happens in your gut, and your diet will make a difference. You've got a kilo of gut bacteria, and the main one that produces brain chemicals is E. coli. And they produce the precursors. It's a bit like the key cutters, and the clamps for the key cutters are the vitamins and minerals. So if you're lacking in a diet of vitamin and minerals, that may be one reason why you're not producing enough brain chemicals. And with some people, if you give them high doses of particular vitamins and minerals, their brain works a lot better. So that's what I needed to say to you today. Your gut and your diet and your lifestyle, medication, and what you know about ADHD will help you manage your life a whole lot better. So we're looking to help you improve your relationship with yourself, your relationship with other people, and your relationship with your future. That's from me. Back to Manoj.
Yeah, thank you, Di. We are going to talk about the ABCD. Thank you very much, Di. That was very comprehensive. Di, can I actually ask the first question, actually?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to tell us a little bit more about the cocktail that we've been talking about here?
Look up the website hardynutritional.com.
Okay.
And there's another website, truehope.com. Go and have a look at that. But I want to hear from Michelle Toner, so I'm conscious that I don't want to take up her time.
No, not at all. Yeah. So, guys, we're going to now go to the coach with the best coach in Australia. That's what I would say. Definitely. Michelle, that is my coach. So, Janish, can you please start that?
Thank you, Di. Thank you very much for that information, and it's lovely always hearing you speak. And thank you, Manoj, for putting this on. And I love your webinar in all its ADHD glory. Bless you. I think it's so wonderful. So keeping with the D theme, I thought I might talk about the double life. And there are a couple of things, and I'm just starting my timer because once I start talking, heaven knows it's out for me to stop. So there you go. I'm going to talk for 5 minutes. When I did my master's, I found that a lot of people I worked with spoke about the double life. And let's see, Janish, if I can. No, I'm going to have to ask you to move. There you go. I've moved too many. Oh, my goodness. I got all trigger happy. Give me a minute. This is me messing up, not Janish. And there you go. So these are the wonderful clients that I work with. I just love, I have a bit of a love affair with ADHD and the fun and the excitement and the spontaneity, but I don't for a minute trivialize the challenges it causes. So on the left, I've got a picture of a little girl, you know, just thinking how lovely it would be to dance with a statue. On the right, I once had, oops, no, it's gone ahead and I didn't do anything. A young man came to my office one day from school and said, Michelle, I learned to do origami today. And he whipped out this piece of paper and made this beautiful crane. And then he said, oh, that's my detention slip. I shouldn't have used that possibly for origami. And it just became such a touching moment for me. You can see I've whited out his name and his detention details. The reason he got detention was not because he was a badly behaved boy or anything. I'm trying to go to the next slide, Janish, and it's a build-up. So if you could do that for me. The biggest problem that I work with my clients is executive functions, yes. So people with ADHD could be really smart, can be really resourceful, very creative, but have problems with activation, focusing, maintaining effort, getting started, modulating their emotions. They have terrible problems with their working memory, their short-term memory, and then monitoring their actions. And so if you think of the executive functions of the brain, Guy was talking about the prefrontal cortex. It's the part of the brain that organizes all of the other parts. I like the conductor of an orchestra. And when you've got ADHD, as Thomas Brown says, sometimes the conductor goes to sleep or he goes out for a smoko. And so it's very hard to be organized and to manage all of these essential parts of your life. So I need the next slide, Janish, please. And yes, so what happens is people with ADHD operate on two levels of functioning. They will, in a boardroom, there'll be the brainstormers, there'll be the ideas people, 20 ideas a minute. They'll be very vocally engaged sometimes, very able to articulate their thoughts. But then on the other hand, they find the follow through really difficult. They know what to do, but when the time comes, it doesn't happen. They find it hard to be organized. Time is a black hole that swallows them up. And so they're actually operating on these two levels. What happens is that these challenges that they have often disguise the strengths that they have. So people don't see all of the wonderful potential that is there because of the struggles they have. But something that makes me even sadder is sometimes their gifts are discounted because of their challenges. So someone will say, well, yes, he's the best engineer in our company. He visualized our beautiful oil and gas platform, but he just can't write the report. So really, what good is he to us? Get someone else to write the report. So what happens is there's a lot of shame that goes with this. People assume that if you're an intelligent person, you should be able to do these things which the average brain takes for granted. But in fact, they're the most challenging things for people with ADHD. Next slide, please, Janish. So there's this double level of functioning, and people will say, so the people in my master study said that they lived a double life. There was the front that they presented to the world, and then there was everything that's going on for them underneath, like Di's iceberg. And people will say to me often, I do so much work, I get my life in control, I get a system in place, I get a diary working, blah, 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 and then before I know it, everything slips away. So I'm in this chaos again, and I've got to start all over again and build myself up. And so what we do as coaches is, oops, I'm just about done. That's my time. I can have the next slide, please, Janish. What we do as coaches is work in that zone to, Russell Ramsey calls us executive function avatars. So we work with people to design strategies in those areas where there are difficulties. Next slide, please, Janish. How to develop your own version of time management, which isn't the same as the next person's. How to develop your version of being organized. What is your system for checking your emails? What is your system for getting to work on time, which is not the same as everyone else's? So we always are sure to have motivators and reminders at the point of performance when you need them. Because reminding yourself when you leave the office that you've got a meeting at 10 a.m. is not going to work at 10 a.m. Next slide, please, Janish. And then the last thing that we do is to help people make things stick. So let's create a personal procedures manual about yourself. When you found something that works, don't expect yourself to remember it, but create a manual about yourself. And once a month, check in to see how are my successes tracking? Am I still doing the things that I know are going to keep me on track? And if I'm not, what can I do to just mix it up a little bit? And final slide, I'm sorry to go a minute over time. The final slide I wanted to say was, before you hire a coach, please, coaching is not a regulated industry, so anyone can call themselves a coach, and many people do. You need to be sure that your coach is a member of the International Coach Federation, has done ADHD specific coach training like Manoj and I have done, that they either have an ICF credential or they're on the path to getting their ICF credential.
Yeah.
So my passion is to help people with ADHD be themselves, not have to live a double life, and thrive in our society. Thank you for the opportunity to talk, Manoj.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Michelle. That was lovely. That was very, very well done. Thanks a lot. So, Janish, we're just going to go to the last part of it. And before we do that, we've got the next attention coach, which is Irene. Irene is going to be talking to us about shame. So, Irene.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Sorry about the video not working and this not working and that not working, but guess what? It's life. None of us are perfect. And I think once we start accepting that, especially people with ADHD, we'll be a little bit kinder to ourselves. I'm a life coach, and it's only lately that I've become interested in ADHD. And that happened actually when one of my clients, Phyllis, asked me to accompany her to her psychiatrist to get her diagnosis. And it was very interesting because as I sat there and I observed her actually receiving this diagnosis, she was hanging out for and wondering about for God knows how long after being misdiagnosed many times with other various things. It was interesting to see that her first reaction was relief. It was almost like the jigsaw pieces that had been muddled up everywhere finally started coming together. Mm-hmm. And then after the relief, there was grief. You know, and she spoke about, if I'd been diagnosed earlier, would this have happened? Would my life have been better? What would have happened? And then came along what I like to call the silent, anonymous soldier, shame. And I just could not believe, even though we all suffer from it and we have it, and it's what I would call a major emotion, ADHD people seem to just suffer undeniably high, just feelings of shame, just absolute feelings of shame. And it made me stop and it made me think. And I spoke to her about this and I delved in deeper about shame, and I understand that it's a master emotion and it's really a fear of disconnection. And I think of, and I spoke about young people, young children in school that are judged by their teachers, their parents, because with ADHD, I mean, you know, if you're not focusing, you're looking out the window and suddenly, you know, you're a dreamer or you don't follow directions, which is a very normal thing with somebody with ADHD to find difficult to do. Suddenly, you know, you don't fit the mold. Just don't fit in. So you hear people saying, you know, you should be ashamed of yourself. That's shameful. And the one that, you know, classic one is, I'm ashamed of you, almost as if shame is contagious. And people with ADHD, I've found really, this becomes ingrained in them. They take it on board and it grows. Shame is like a fungus. And ADHD people work on emotion rather than logic. So this shame almost engulfs them. And it's very difficult for them to move on. Their self-esteem is knocked because of it. And it's something that really needs to be addressed. And I've seen that ADHDers that I've met, I would call them triers. They love to try things. And what I try to say and what I'm learning about shame, and especially with people with ADHD, they need to confront it. The one thing that shame doesn't like is being confronted, being spoken about, having a light shone on it. If you put empathy with shame, that's it. That's one way to discover that you can actually get rid of shame. You need to challenge it. I think too that if we build a support system, we find out for ADHDers what their positives are in life, and we build a support system around that as coaches, that we can actually discuss and talk about their shame, take it out of the dark, shine some light on it. and stop believing that we're flawed because of something we said or something we didn't say or something we thought or something we didn't think. The hardest critic for an ADHDer is themselves. Just, you know, between their ears, they're the hardest critic and they're harsh on themselves. And we need, I think, to talk about self-compassion, something they find difficult to do because it's easier to go with what they've been doing all their life. It's their fault, they're embarrassed, they're hoping possibly people won't find out there's anything wrong with them because they're ashamed of maybe having ADHD, some of their actions, their impulsivity, their distractibility, whatever it is. So I think building the system, finding out your positives, finding out what works for you, and being at peace with it, I think would help considerably. So to me, shame needs to move before we can work on self-esteem. And I think it's a very important issue for people with ADHD to address. So that's my little snippet for today.
Thank you very much, Irene. That was very well said and came right from the heart. So Jinish, can we go back to the Know Your D presentation? So guys, this is what we are looking at when we say get to know your ADHD. Following on from what Michelle said and what Irene and Dr. Dai were talking about, we're moving on to how to get to know your ADHD. So Jinish, the next slide, please. We simply call it the D story. As you can see, the traditional medical model at the moment is based on the treatment of a specific symptom. A cluster of symptoms, we may usually call that as a disease. And as Dr. Dai pointed out before, it is usually treated with a specific pill. It does seem to apply to both mental as well as the physical ailments, but as we can say, the pills definitely don't teach skills. So moving on to the next slide, Jinish. Usually when somebody comes to us as coaches with ADHD, they usually have memory issues. They always have a feeling of panic, which is what I've been getting ever since this webinar has been going up the Khyber. Emotional dysregulation seems to get all over the place. So yes, at the moment, everything you need to, the way I describe it with ADHD, it took me a while to understand, but you seem to find a label. And then, you have the fable of that label. So right now, every bit of my emotional dysregulation, which is actually happening as we speak, and there's nothing I can do about it, right? It is the feeling of panic. Everything's going wrong. Everything's wrong. So my label right now, the one that I have built at the moment is Jinish, poor man, even though I do know for a fact that he's been working overnight and really hard trying to address everything here. But we have been versions of the webinar. So I'm done with shame. I'm done with the blame. I'm done with the shame. When I stuff up, I just think, oops, I did it again. And that's exactly what I'm telling you guys. It's stuffed up. So we're just going to move on with it, Jinish. Yeah, because Jinish, in my mind, the first thought, the negativity that came was, now, is Jinish doing this purposely to script up? And I'm thinking, not really. But that's exactly what happens. That's how my D reacted to me. And until I found my scaffolding, which was in the shape of externalizing everything. And that's exactly the system which I help now the clients do. Michelle pointed out that, yes, there are coaches and it's not a regulated industry, but there are only a couple of us. There are a couple of bodies in the world that actually give out this. And Irene has been lovely at joining us. And she's actually set to go to ADCA now with all her potential issues, Michelle, later on. So, Jinish, let's go to the other one. So when people come to us and they are in crisis, we know that the best practice is always going to be appropriate medication on mindfulness, talk therapy and coaching, and healthy lifestyle. None of this is really rocket science, but for people with ADHD to get through the executive function challenges, which is what Michelle was talking about, it is the action of being able to plan, prioritize, and do items in sequence that lead to a fruitful action. So what we are trying to simply do is make it available externally so that people can live their lives better and find their scaffolding. Next slide, Janish. We are very clear in what we talk about when we're talking about the people. The only people that are allowed to talk about the drugs are the people who have the right degrees, and they are the doctors. They're the only ones that should talk to us about the drugs. They are the only ones that are trained to talk about the drugs. So we will leave that up to them. However, we can build a little scaffolding for ourselves and create a personal operations manual, rather like a how to do it for your own self, which helps you get through your day and find your direction. Next slide, Janish. How do we do this? I think, Janish, you're moving the other way. You also seem to have ADHD today. So let's go. Yeah. Okay. So our tools help. As coaches, we love actionable strategies. Yeah. Value real time, in-person connection. We know ADHD is about doing, not knowing. We all know what to do. It's just putting all those steps together that we need to be able to do this. So going to the next slide, Janish. All that we are doing here is simply building a structure, providing people a calendar where they can action and find an anchor that they need. And we simply do a daily structure of mindfulness, reflection, and symptom tracking. Go to the last slide, Janish. Come on. What do we do? How do we do it? It's not rocket science. This is what I found. If I remember to do the daily intent in the morning and kept all my symptoms during the day in a book, the problem was that I had 14 books at one point that I was looking at. I would never be able to remember which particular book I wrote the action in. So every time I would come to start the executive function, it would be like it's brand new. Every day would start with a brand new set of tools, a brand new shiny thing that came. And my poor working memory would basically mean that I would start every day at 8 a.m. and by about 1 o'clock, I was exhausted because all I'd done was try to remember where everything else was, until I figured out a system where if we just simply write it down in the same place using the external help of someone else and build a structure, that really helped. Move to the next slide, Janish, please. That's pretty much what it is that we have right now in relation to what we're looking at here. What we were really talking about is the different myths that we've covered here. And that particular slide was the actual video. So the video talks about the different myths. So Janish, stop sharing, please. And just let's go. Don't worry about the videos now. But all we're going to talk about is how we're going to talk the different myths. So the myths that we've covered are shame. That is really strong. ADHD is a real struggle. It definitely is. What about it is a struggle? When people come and ask me and say, but how come some people have ADHD and they get through the day? If you have attentional issues, it's not necessary that those attentional issues can impact at such a degree that you cannot live your life. However, for some people, it is very, very real that they can impact you when you can't get through your day. That's exactly what we're talking about. So there is an answer for literally everything that we have with ADHD and the myths that are there surrounding it, including the lack of awareness, including people within our medical professions within Australia who still believe that it's not real. There are lots of people who are fighting that particular battle. There are lots of people who are advocating towards the right goals, the right things. ADPA is an organization, which is the ADHD Association of Professionals. They have been given a grant this year as well. Both Michelle, Diane, and I are members of it. And same for Dr. Didi. The other struggles with ADHD are really as because of what it does to our brain with the amygdala hijack. Now, the video would show you that there was a color and how it would stop it and just be frozen, which is what is happening to me right now. But I'm going to stop right here and go down to some of the Q&A that we have and start taking that. So, Junish, you can start with the questions which people have put forward, and as and when we'll start to answer it. I think I've also got access to it. We've been getting the bits come in.
Yes, I'll get Rasat to do that for me, please.
Okay. So the first question that I have, which is, I think for Dr. Dai, we were talking about, and Dai, that's why I asked you that question, which was in relation to the cocktail, because people had already sent it. But what we're going to do is that we're simply going to put that in the notes because Dr. Dai already answered that particular question. Yeah. Somebody's actually asked us, do you believe that ADHD is overdiagnosed in children? Dan, do you want to take that or do you want
to? Dai's on mute.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I thought you were raising a hand there, Michelle, because you go, you know the data.
Well, I know that it's quite a common myth, and in fact, it's quite underdiagnosed. And the reason I jumped is because in WA we have very definite figures on how many people are diagnosed or how many are treated with medication. We keep records. So we know that worldwide, we think that 5% of children would have the symptoms for ADHD, and about, people say 4.4% of adults or 4% of adults. In WA, 1.6% of children are taking medication for ADHD out of a possible 5%. And 0.7% of adults are taking medication for ADHD, and those are official figures. So, in fact, it's proof that ADHD is being underdiagnosed. There are some people who will be diagnosed and not taking medication, but not that many. So, there's no overdiagnosis of ADHD in Australia. Sorry, Dai, I'm sure you have something to add.
I think what happens is, so can you hear me?
Yeah.
Things run in cycles. A new diagnosis or an issue that's always been there gets some popularity, and then you hear about it. Well, this is ADHD Awareness Month, and the chatter on one of the psychiatrist WhatsApps was, gosh, there seems to be lots of people wanting stimulant medication. Well, they may want that because if they have ADHD, it will stimulate their brains up to functioning, so they will feel calm and normal and productive and be able to think clearly. So there are a lot of fears that this medication will be abused, and I think that's pretty groundless, although a few people can do a lot of damage if they sell their drugs. So there is a little bit of diversion of some medications, but all the other medications we know of get diverted as well. It's funny that the ADHD medications really do get picked on. I don't think that's particularly fair, but it's what we're dealing with. And I think what we have to do is just continue to educate people about what the situation is.
Okay. So some of the other questions, I'm just going to read them out as a starting point. Somebody's actually asked that speed up. So what does that mean that over 80% of adults with ADHD are not diagnosed, given that there aren't enough doctors to go around and so many people needing diagnosis? What does Dr. Grocott think we should do? Because Dr. Grocott, I identified you as the only specialist in Australia before, which is not,
It's not true.
A specialist, but it's just that there's a large number. So sorry.
What do we do? It's a chicken and egg thing. We do know we need training, but we basically need funding for training. So I would advise the people who would like to get into a doctor sooner, talk to your member of parliament. Get on the talkback radio and say, why is it that I can get a diagnosis for my diabetes, but I can't get a diagnosis for my ADHD? we're doing our best at the various ends. Michelle is on the board of the Australian ADHD Professionals Association, and they've been advocating with the Minister for Health. He's well aware of it. And I think we're at the situation where if we raise awareness, there'll be a lot of people saying, oh gosh, I've got ADHD, and yes, I would like a diagnosis. And then we say, well, there's no training, but there's not going to be any training unless people realise there's an awareness. So we're going to go through a really difficult time where people know they've got a problem, but they can't get help for it. I think all you can keep doing is jumping up and down, get on the waiting list for 1 or 2 different people. To find a psychiatrist, you look up, find a psychiatrist for the College of Psychiatrists website, and you can search, because all the psychiatrists who are in private practice have put up on their website, on the website, do they deal with all sorts of different disorders, and there's quite a number who deal with ADHD.
Yep. What we also have is we've actually created a 1-800-00-ADHD hotline. And what we are actually trying to do is simply write down people's details as part of ADHD Awareness Month and see if we can put them in touch with the right people for the moment. Yeah. So please go ahead, give us a call. All we're going to do is take down your details and see if we can find somebody which is appropriately trained for you.
One other idea, Manoj, is actually to have a petition, because if you've got hundreds of people, I think the figures I know would be very conservative, is 2% of the Australian population of adults. They're not even, half of them don't even know that they've got ADHD. So it's important that we do have awareness, but I think you need to get up a petition, and all you people on the 1-800 number should be able to tell you, I believe I have ADHD and I'd like some help, and I can't get help. And if you submit that to your member of parliament, that's how we change things in a democratic society.
So that is absolutely right, Di, based on some of the studies that we are looking at that is coming from the US as well as Canada, because in Canada, a nurse practitioner as well as America can actually diagnose ADHD, whereas in Australia, even a GP cannot diagnose ADHD. And I do know that there are people working towards it, but it's very, very slow at the moment. So that's a great idea, and we will look into it and get the petition up and running along with that side of it. Yeah. Okay. We've got some other questions here. Why do you think parents are so reluctant in agreeing to give their child medication?
Should I answer that?
You can, Di.
Okay. Well, we had what I've been calling the ADHD wars between 2006 to 2009, when the College of Paediatricians were getting the very first the very first ADHD guidelines in Australia. And there was a group of people who think that ADHD is a myth, something organised by drug companies, and that if you drug your children with Ritalin, they will become zombies. Well, people who I might give Ritalin to, if they tell me, look, I feel like I'm a zombie, well, I go, well, it's the wrong medication for you. Let's try something else. But there was a great big, well, it was a smear campaign against some of the doctors involved. It was actually said, I think, in the newspaper that these doctors were in the pockets of the drug companies because they'd done some research. There's so much research done in ADHD. I mean, we've had this medication Ritalin since the 1930s. It's very well researched and it works very well. But there was this great big horror campaign, and then a campaign against one of the other people who had written many of the articles from overseas. So the bottom line is there was such a big hoo-ha that the guidelines were dropped. If you want to see them, they actually are on the College of Physicians. You can Google them. They're put in as draft, and they're jolly good. It's not just how you manage ADHD from the medical point of view, but how should they be treated in schools, and if they're in the hands of the jails or the police. So some very good guidelines, but because they were dropped, there are no guidelines in Australia. You don't have guidelines, you haven't got a disorder. And doctors aren't going to be saying, oh, I'm diagnosing this thing. If someone's going to be shooting at them, you've got no leg to stand on because you've got no defence, which is why one of the very first things that the Minister for Health gave the AADPA, Michelle's group, was the money to get some guidelines, and we're getting them. when we have guidelines in Australia, we will have an actual real disorder, and then people can say to their doctors, why wasn't I diagnosed with this? And I know I have a friend who says we ought to go and sue the doctors. I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think we need to be in fighting against each other because there's so few of us, we need to work together. But I think it doesn't hurt if you say, hey, here's the guidelines. I meet these guidelines. Why can't I have some help? And so I just encourage everybody from different facets of the ADHD community to work together and see if we can make a difference for the good of everybody.
That's very well done. Thanks, Di. That is perfectly answered. So we have somebody who's actually saying about the drug Vyvanse, and they have asked a specific question. Is Vyvanse the same drug as speed?
It is definitely not the same drug as speed. Vyvanse is dexamphetamine attached to lysine. That's a prodrug. It gets into the body very quickly from the gut to the bloodstream, and then nothing happens because it's too big to get into the brain. When the body takes away the lysine, it's an amino acid, it's food, goes to make some protein, then the dexamphetamine is released, and that's able to get into the brain, and then it goes and lodges in the little vacuum cleaner, so you get a better dopamine message. And then it's excreted through the kidneys. Methamphetamine is ice or speed. Speed is lower potency, ice is very potent. Those things do the same effect in the reuptake, what I call the reuptake vacuum cleaners, in the sending side of the synapse, the nerve, which wants to send a message, sends off the dopamine, then it gets recycled. And the illicit drugs do that, but they've also got a nasty little tail that dexamphetamine doesn't have, and that lodges and blocks the receptor, causes huge messages. So the receptors change, you get downgrading of the receptors. You also get neuroinflammation and brain damage from ice and speed, and cocaine's a bit like the Ritalin side of things. No, it's not. However, all of those medications, the medications and the drugs are amphetamines. That's just the class. So if you have a drug test, you will be positive and you've taken some Vyvanse, but no ice or speed, you will be positive for amphetamine. Then they do another test to find out if there's any methamphetamine. It's perfectly legal to drive with dexamphetamine or Ritalin in your system. And in fact, the research says you could be a better driver if you have ADHD and you take your medications. It is illegal to drive with the other stuff because that causes brain damage. It's very, very nasty.
Guys, I'm just going to take a pause because Michelle has been very kind, and thank you very much, Di, as well. But Michelle has to go. So Michelle,
Yes.
thanks very much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye,
Have a
Michelle.
good ADHD month. Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Janice. You were a champion.
Thank
Stayed
you.
calm through the whole thing. Goodbye.
Yes, you did. So, okay, I'm just going to look at the questions again. Some of the questions that people have asked at the moment are, is there any link between ADHD and trauma? Di, did you want to take that, or you want me to give it a go?
You give it a go.
Okay. Well, definitely. There is a very... I've actually been working with a patient who's undergoing trauma therapy at the moment. So there is a lot of link between ADHD and trauma, but I'm going to replay the example of this one particular person that we're talking about. Trauma has manifested in her life in many different shapes, ways, and forms. Part of it also has come about as a result of the disassociation that was prevalent earlier on in her life when she actually experienced the trauma. With ADHD, he didn't remember a lot of the trauma that was happening because of the actual issues with executive function at certain points. It is only when she was actually sat down and we started to talk about, let's go backwards and just start documenting your life, because that's one of the things we look at as coaches that we do. And I was working with her psychiatrist in just helping her document her life, that we came across different stages. What we were trying to do, what we simply started with, was a very simple exercises looking at pictures of when she was growing up. And he suddenly looked at one of them. I said, I don't remember it. I don't remember it. And that suddenly triggered a memory. And all I was doing was simply documenting it with her. It was a very emotional experience because after that I had sent it to her doctor, who advised us that if she's okay with it, we'd go deeper into it, which we did. So yes, ADHD does definitely have an impact with trauma, and how it is dealt with. You definitely need somebody like who's well trained in it to do it. As coaches, what we do if something like that happens is we work very, very closely with the medical team, because we are not the ones who actually do anything other than be their ears and eyes and type it up. And then the doctors would give us the direction in how to deal with it. So Ty, taking it from there.
Does that answer the person's question, or do they have another question?
They probably would have a little bit more as to what else that happens with the trauma.
Okay. Let me just say that ADHD is genetic. So if your frontal lobe isn't working very well, you can't calm yourself down so well, then it may be that there are other people in the family in generations above you who haven't got that same ability. The role of a parent is to calm the children down when there's a problem and get to a solution. And when we're adults, we are supposed to get to have the equipment to do that for ourselves. So we have a problem, our limbic system tells us we've got a problem, and our frontal lobe helps calm things down and return to peace. If the family has lots of ADHD genes, often the family is chaotic. That's going to be traumatic for the child just because they haven't learned the skills of calming themselves down. The other thing is when bad things happen, if you don't know how to call out for help, and a lot of ADHD people feel quite isolated, they don't like asking for help because of the shame, they often don't return to peace. So small traumas become big, and the rejection sensitivity means they're traumatized a lot anyway. So people with ADHD, they often cover up their pain and their trauma with different addictions and avoidance. And quite often when they're treated and they start to have like glasses on their brain, they can see the mess of their lives and they deal with the grief. Sometimes they remember things that have happened to them that they weren't able to focus on before. And one of the difficulties is they often want to get it fixed immediately, but they don't quite have the skills. So it is difficult. I think the early diagnosis is like a roller coaster. But let me just tell you, trauma can be dealt with, because the traumatic memory is like a video in your head where you haven't found a solution to it. You still feel in overload emotionally about it. So we help people to find what is the subtitle that they, as a kid, have put on that particular memory, and then using their frontal lobe and standing outside themselves and realizing it's not happening now, and they have got some skills to be able to manage those feelings. They sort of rewrite, not what happened, because that happened, and if it was awful, it still is awful, but they can change the way they see it. And that's CBT and a lot of trauma counselling. But basically, you have to say hello to it in order to be able to say goodbye. But a person who's got an ADHD brain all over the place can't even say hello, let alone say goodbye. So I think ADHD and trauma often go hand in hand. And the good thing is, once you start to get to deal with the issues of an ADHD diagnosis and start to deal with the trauma, it's wonderful the way people can get to the point where they've processed it. It's not a wound anymore, it's a scar. Yes, it happened to me, but I've become stronger because of it, and I can move on and I can help other people to move on.
Okay. So we've got a lot of questions that have come through, which are asking for lists, etc. I will take down all those questions that are asking for a list of coaches, a list of etc., and we'll make them available for you and send it out. There is no list of coaches that I know of at the moment. However, we have done an ADHD directory, which we can simply send it out to you guys. And I do also know that ADPA are preparing one right now. So that might become live in the next few days. Yeah. Preeti Kapoor has asked a question. We are parents of a child who has some of the symptoms that we heard, but some others who are not our adult son. How do we get a professional diagnosis done, and from where? The son is based in Canberra. Thanks. Preeti, may I take this, or do you want to answer it?
You need to find a GP to refer you to a specialist. And if the child is under the age of 19, get them to a paediatrician as soon as you possibly can. So GP to a paediatrician. If they're diagnosed before their 19th birthday, the long-acting medication is subsidised for them for now and the rest of their life. If they're diagnosed from their 19th birthday onwards and they want the long-acting medication, they have to pay quite a bit for that. That is going to change, we hope maybe January, but early next year. And then everybody will have their long-acting medication subsidised. So that's going to make my life a lot easier. But certainly, I also suggest to people go onto the different websites. There's Attitude Magazine, there's on YouTube How to ADHD. Manoj is working on a ADHD school of topics and things like that. So educate yourself. And I think the earlier that the family knows about it and helps the child with their strengths and weaknesses, the better it is.
Okay. Peter has actually asked, Manoj, because of difficulties at the start of the webinar, he missed details of where they can view this again. Yes, you certainly can, including in all its glory. So we're not going to edit it at all. I promise you, view it in all its glory, whatever it was. Yeah. Yeah. An anonymous attendee has asked, is emotional overload, particularly in the morning, and chaos common? They have also said that they have several sleep problems, so taking stimulants makes it worse.
Go, Manoj.
Okay. Emotional overload, particularly in the morning, afternoon, night, every time. It is really, really, really overwhelming. The concept of time, you've asked particularly in the morning. Yeah. So whether it's morning, afternoon time, with ADHD, there's time, the time conundrum is it's either now or not now. Yeah. Sleep problems are definitely really, really strong with a lot of people with ADHD. Yes. However, in the morning, I'm going to go based on my experience. When I used to wake up, it used to be like, what do I need to do now? What was it that I was looking for? So the next shiny thing, whatever reacted and something happened, that's what I would react on. And that's what shaped my day. Forget about the intent, forget about anything else. The first thing that actually happened, that was an external trigger. So yes, emotional dysregulation can be really strong because inside us, we have this inbuilt feeling, for want of a better word. There's something that I needed to do, but I'm not doing it right now. That could be simply our working memory. It could be a whole lot of things. So in answer to your question, how to resolve it, if that is also part of the question, it is to have one place where you've recorded your actions and we create a routine. Following that routine again and again helps root out the emotional trauma that happens in the morning as a result of not remembering what you're supposed to do. Okay. I think that's pretty much the answer. The next one is depression the result of ADHD symptoms or something genetic that links to the ADHD disorder? Catherine Tran has asked that question.
It's probably for me. The genes for ADHD, it's quite genetic. There's often an overlap with genes for depression, and they're often genes which affect the factories that make what I'm calling the little keys, the neurotransmitters. And again, if you treat one, often the other one gets better. So there's a biological basis. There's also the fact that you get depressed, anybody gets depressed if they've failed or if they feel helpless, hopeless, and they don't feel they can go any further. So I have a little picture, which I probably should have done a slide of. It's called the performance and tasks graph. So if you think of, if you haven't got many tasks to do, you don't perform much. And then if you have more things to do, you're supposed to do a bit more performance. So the average person who doesn't have ADHD, they've got a few things to do, they're in first gear. And then they go up to second gear, more things to do. Then they get to top gear and they're cruising along. And then if they get more things to do, they slowly go down the other side. So their picture is like an inverted U. That is not the ADHD picture. ADHD people, if they've got something to do, they do nothing. If they've got something more to do, they still do nothing. Then they keep doing nothing. And oh gosh, then it's the deadline is tomorrow. Suddenly they scream up like a skyscraper and they're brilliant. and then they're doing really well, and then one last thing happens, and then they scream down and they crash in the bottom of their skyscraper, and that's where we pick them up with depression. So they pop in to see their GP or their psychiatrist, and they go, I'm so depressed, and they're sitting there smiling at me. I think, you don't look like you've got a biological depression. They're depressed because they've got a reason for being depressed. So what we do is we teach them, and we send them to the coaches and go, you need some scaffolding. The reason you crashed from the top of your skyscraper when you were so awesome is because you didn't know how you got up there in the first place. So when you crash, you don't know how to get back down again, back up again. So what we do is we teach them 2 steps. First step is see the finished product, or if you're on the other side of your skyscraper, see the mess cleaned up. And if you can see it clearly, you can do it. And then the next thing is you do a 2%. Maybe it's an assignment you've got to do, you've been avoiding. Well, open the book and read the question, that's all. If then you get so excited, you scream up to the top of your skyscraper, you're off. You have a performance problem, not a knowing problem. So we go, step 1 is see the whole thing, and then step 2, 2% start. And if that doesn't work and you haven't screamed up the top of your skyscraper, you do step 1 over again. You see a smaller portion of the problem and start that. When you can get yourself to function well, as you start to fall over on the other side into this depression that is so common, the crash and burn with ADHD, if you start to find yourself in a mess, you go, how would I see this working for me? And you do the same sort of thing. But that's got to be learnt, which is why we send people to coaches, psychologists. Family members have often done that sort of scaffolding. But just to understand that ADHD people are prone to depression because they get themselves into messes. That's probably not going to happen. What we're aiming to do is, come back from the edge a bit earlier so you don't fall over right off your skyscraper.
Well, okay. What is happening at the moment? This is a question put out by somebody, and I cannot. It's R. Clancy. What is happening to make the diagnosis and ongoing treatment affordable? I spend approximately $1,500 to $4,000 on doctors, medication, psychologists, etc. And he signed it as Raymond. So Raymond, I think there's a lot of it that is actually happening right now, which they're talking about making the treatment affordable, starting with Vyvanse is now being put on the PBS.
No, it's not, Manoj. So let me interrupt it. A decision was made by the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee in April this year that it would be subsidised. But that usually leads to 5 to 6 months of discussing things about supply and cost with the pharmaceutical company. That's been delayed by COVID. The latest I've heard is maybe January if we're lucky. It will happen early next year. The PABC also wrote to the ADHD Professionals Association and said, we need to be careful. How do we know what a retrospective diagnosis is? Someone who wasn't diagnosed when they were a kid. What evidence do we have to say? Do we have to say that we have history from their family or their school reports? Well, lots of people don't have family or school reports to give them the history. So I think they're going to be very generous. And I think it's going to be if a doctor who's suitably qualified has taken history and believes it to be the case, that the person has ADHD, then they're going to be given the retrospective diagnosis. That's the first thing. And then secondly, I have heard that the long-acting methylphenidates, the other medications are likely to be subsidised as well, but we don't know any more than that. But I'll be the first to tell you when I find out. It's going to make my life so much easier.
Certainly. I think what you're also talking about there, Di, is the actual bit that one of the reasons was that Vyvanse could only be prescribed if they already had a diagnosis by the age of 18. Is that correct?
Yep, that is correct. And 18 is 18 years and 364 days. So the day before your 19th birthday, it's not just your 18th birthday. It's interesting that they thought that this was a diagnosis that when you blow out 18 birthday candles, you suddenly don't have it anymore. It's the only diagnosis in the book with that myth attached to it.
Yes, that is true. So, but I think also what Raymond is asking is that, is there anything that is actually being done to make the treatment more affordable? So yes, there are bits and pieces that are happening. There's lots of advocacy that is going through. We have been petitioning, and we are raising the awareness to make ADHD available on the NDIS. There's a separate question, so perhaps we could take both of these at the same time. At the moment, if you only have a diagnosis of ADHD, you, in most instances that I have known of personally, that I've helped people fill in the application, nobody just simply gets the NDIS. Yep, it's only when you have a comorbidity that is linked to it that we are working with the Disabilities Association, I think, and a new submission was put in only last month, which actually talks about making ADHD listed as a disability. Hopefully, will then make it available on the NDIS, hence making some funding available to people. However, the reports that we hear are very hit and miss, because the NDIS submission depends on state to state. It also depends on the officer making the diagnosis. And a lot of the officers are not really have been given the adequate amount of training. So what we have done is we worked out a way of actually putting all the question answers together. Actually, ADHD Foundation Australia have a very good web, something available on their website, which we will make available to everybody after this, so that you can have a look. They've actually made a pro forma sheet where people can just fill in a template and take it from there. Yeah, so that should help at all. And we'll send all these things out at the end of the seminar for you guys, right? To the mailing list, and especially the people who've actually asked this question. Dan, there's an actual question directed at you. Dan, do you use my DNA regarding medication? My son's one shows Ritalin, etc. would not be effective. I'm not really sure what that means, so I'll leave that for you.
My DNA is psychopharmacogenetics, psycho being drugs, psychobrain, pharmaco is drugs, and genetics is the basically the blueprints in every cell of your body. Specifically relates to the enzymes in the liver which metabolize or activate different medications that we use. Yes, it's useful for some of the drugs that we would use, for the medications we would use for ADHD, but it's not helpful to, it doesn't say anything about whether dexamphetamine or Ritalin would be helpful. So no, I don't use that. I do use it with patients if they've had lots of different medications of different classes for depression, anxiety, pain, various sort of things like that, and they've had bad reactions. So I usually suggest they get the DNA test. I think it's a swab of your mouth and it's about $150. And then I get a printout of which of the liver enzymes might be slow or very fast. If they're very slow, then a drug can build it up. If it's very fast, then the medication may not work so much. So not routinely. Usually, I mean, people can go ahead and do it themselves. They don't need to ask their doctors to refer them, and some are keen to find out. But I tend to try and spare the expense. So I would only go down that path if we think that's going to be helpful.
Okay, yeah. Somebody's just asked the question, so how do you deal with shame? I'm just gonna actually go back to Irene, because you're talking about it, Irene. So did you want to take that?
I think you gotta label it, be out about it, proud about it. Do not keep it a secret. Talk about it. Just put it into the light. Put it out there. And I'm not saying talk to every Tom, Dick and Harry about it, but find somebody that you trust. Find somebody that you respect enough that you can share your innermost thoughts with, and they're not going to judge you. Talk about it. That is the biggest thing with shame. Get it out there. Talk about it all the time. That's the only way you'll get rid of it. Talk about it. Challenge it. That would be my answer. Challenge it. Give it a name. I call mine Frank. And I talk to Frank quite often, out loud. Not now, Frank. So, yeah.
Well, and thanks for that, Irene. I'm also going to actually butt in right to the end of that. Shame is something which is very strong with ADHD. We carry it all the time. There is that thing that, the imposter syndrome never leaves you. It is always hanging. It is always there. And when people are trying to tell you, why don't you just buckle up and do something? Yeah, mate, you don't really need to, because we've already done it a million times ourselves. So as far as shame, as you said, Irene, yes, give it a name. But shame often follows with the blame, right?
Mm.
And that seems to be the name of the game, if you really want to call it that. So shame, blame often go together. And it also falls in line with the self-esteem issues, etc. Right? So it seems to be that shame for me and for a lot of people that I've actually dealt with, it almost becomes like a habit. It's automatic, a trigger. You can set it off, and it's like that. It's an instant reaction. But the good part is, like any other habit, if you work at it, it can be tamed.
Absolutely.
Somebody,
Manoj,
sorry, yeah.
sorry, Manoj. I come across people who need more adrenaline and dopamine in their brains for their front of their brain to manage the rest of their brain. And quite often they've fallen into the trap of finding a particular thought pattern which triggers the alarm system and gives them adrenaline. Sometimes they're eating thoughts, sometimes they're self-critical thoughts, sometimes they are obsessive thoughts. And sometimes I wonder whether shame has become the person's go-to. If I've done something wrong and I beat myself up, I get enough dopamine and adrenaline to be able to move myself past this. But like any other addiction, an addiction is a helper which you've used to get you to cope with a problem, but it makes the problem worse. It doesn't fix the problem. So shame can be an addiction, addictive thinking. So if you put it out there and say, you know, I'm not doing cigarettes anymore, and I'm not doing Frank anymore, thanks very much. I think that's a good way of externalizing it and coming to terms with, I choose a different way of thinking. I'm going to be kind to myself.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it comes down to self-compassion and a lot of reframing. And I know a lot of ADHD professional people in their life, they've actually used shame to motivate them. Yeah. So it's interesting how it's just all used in a different way, but it's there, it's huge. And I think it's something that needs to be addressed.
Yep.
Shame can be debilitating. It is something that when you wake up in the morning, as you said, it's a self-feeding prophecy. It's that loop that doesn't really go anywhere, where it just goes back into the other loop, right? As soon as you come across the shame, your amygdala hijack or whatever you want to call it, and back you are at that particular aspect of it again and again and again. And yes, you can actually rationalize it and you can talk yourself out of it. This is where CBT is brilliant. I've actually found in my journey, and becoming a DBT specialist really helped, which was I can never pronounce that word, the dialectical behavior therapy.
Yes.
I don't even know what that word is, but it is fantastic. So one of the things that I found it was when you give it a label and you give it a name, yeah, as you said, Irene, as soon as you've given it a name and you just put it out there, what are they going to do? So I just decided to come out. Before even anybody used to say anything, I used to go, okay, guys, this is what it is. You call me people pleaser, fabulous. So I am. And if you don't like it, that's what it is. Once you already come out, then there's nothing left. What are they going to shame you about? So that was one of the systems that I actually developed as part of our arsenal going forward. And it did really help.
Yeah.
Guys, we've got lots of questions here, but I don't know whether we have the time to answer all of them. But I do have a list of all the questions. And what we're going to do is we're simply going to take answer each and every one of the questions that has been put forward and send it back via email to you guys. Again, I'm not going to apologize for what happened because it is probably, and it is definitely not Janish's fault. It is definitely probably my ADHD that I kept changing things all so often. But it's just something that is a learning exercise for me, and I don't think it's going to happen again. So thank you very much, Dai, for making the time available for us as part of ADHD Awareness Month. I think it's actually quite good the way it happened because it's brought up to light that even though I felt that my shame has been well and truly dealt with, immediately the older patterns came back within a minute. Yeah. So, and thank you very much, Irene.
You're very welcome. Look, all these things come to teach us a lesson. And if we can take a lesson from it, wow.
Absolutely. And thank you very much, Janish and Risa, for all the work that you guys have put in to make this actually happen. And thank you, Janish, for doing it all. Don't you worry about a thing because it should be okay. And
can I thank you on behalf of all of us, Manoj, for all the work that you have put in over the last probably couple of years, getting a website up, organising with lots of other people. Jodie Green was involved as well, and also Michelle, in putting together the scaffolding for ADHD people. There are a number of systems around, some really good coaches. There are some very, very good coaches. But what you're doing is very special. It's absolutely most appreciated. And doing the webinars, more power to you, mate. We're just very proud to know you. Very happy with that.
Very much. This was our virgin webinar, and we are pretty much going to go, and I'm going to put it out there to these guys. We're going to hold a webinar at least much more than we haven't done in the past as part of HD Awareness Week month. So
Yep.
we'll just take it from there. Thanks, Dad.
Why don't you ask the people what topics they'd like, who they'd like you to get on? I know you've won't steal the thunder, but you're talking to some of the greats overseas. And look, one thing I love about the ADHD community is the collaboration. We're not talking down to patients because they can't cope themselves. The ADHD people are just fabulous, very frustrating at times, but absolutely brilliant, and they just do some fabulous things. So I would be suggesting that the ADHD community decides what they want, and we'll do our best to help, and we'll take on feedback.
Yes, I'm going definitely. So we have actually done very small surveys at the moment. And now that we have a system, we're going to do better surveys than this. So one of the things actually, now that I brought up the topic, the webinars that we are talking about running, from the 100 people that we did survey, these were the questions that came back. One was medication, one is affordability, one is definitely NDIS, and then a lot of people want something done on the justice piece. Yeah. Justice model basically being when people get into trouble with ADHD, what can they do? And top of the justice piece seems to figure driving. Yeah. So we do have something there. So I think the next webinar that we could probably do, I think we were already talking about it yesterday, was something on the actual drugs, what it is that they do, a bit more of an understanding. Is that correct, Di? That's what you were
happy to do. I'm happy to do medication. So yes, if people can send in their questions. Also to plug Michelle's organisation in WA, who are having a webinar on the 30th or end of October, at which I'm doing a bit on ADHD and substance use disorder, but she's got a great lineup of people. So there's lots and lots of activity happening. Yeah.
So along with the medication use, the justice piece talks about substance abuse disorder and the fact that the diagnosis at the moment is not that it's underdiagnosed, which is why the prison system at the moment is suffering. I think the
ADHD Foundation is having a conference on this, not for the general public, but for judges, magistrates, lawyers, police. So they're looking at this, particularly youth justice, and that's happening in November. So there's lots of people doing a lot of things.
I actually have been dealing with a gentleman in Detroit who has run a very good program, and we're going to invite him to talk about what he did in Detroit in relation to a ground level program. So this is not talking about the academics. This is not talking about something that is done at the senior level. What he actually created was, he created a support group literally for people in Detroit talking to the prisons and how they went about it and what they actually did. We're going to do those. Also looking at creating a webinar very soon on the need for diagnosis, the ADHD story. And we've also got a website that we've put up, which is a different human design, ADHD. That is going to be played back as a result of the video. And what we are doing there is we're simply going to put out experiences of ADHD people across the board, targeted towards simply putting their story out there. There's no judgment, there's nothing. And the way we are going to do that is whichever way you want to share your story, whether it's through an avatar. If you want a video, we'll give you a video. If you just want to send us a text, that's fine. We'll put it up as a blog for you. You can do it anonymously. You can put it through as a podcast. We're going to leave it up to you. We'll send you more details of that after this webinar. So I'm going to wind up right there. Thank you once again, guys.
Thanks, Manoj.
Thanks, Irene. Thanks, Di.
Wonderful. Thank you.
you, everyone. I would like to add a bit.
Sorry, man.
I know we're starting out very early, and anyone has any questions or would like to get in touch with us, can call us either on our toll-free number, Australia-wide, which is 1-800-002343, which is also ADHD. Another one, so the email is myadhd@attentioncoach.com.au. So you can reach us via these two medium, or also we have social media channels where you can reach us as well. So any questions you might have, or just want to have a talk, we're there for you.
Excellently done. Thank you very much. Risat, you also want to say something? Go ahead.
Thank you very much for all of the participants and panelists. We had a good experience to know basic of the ADHD. Sometimes we got deeper, and I'm very happy a lot of people being more interactive and ask questions. I hope we can ask all questions individually and come to everybody as soon as possible.
So, guys, one of the again with this ADHD, that never seems to end, right? So, I will tell you that one of the things I was going to bring up in another webinar is the experiences that these two poor sods have had with having a boss who's got ADHD off the frigging chart, right? And it's like they wake up and they're like, "We don't know what we're doing today, mate." Yeah, it all together.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Thank you.
guys. See you again.
Bye.
Thank you.